Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 160 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. Like a lot of people, I came to history through literature, getting to know medieval Europe and its people through the words they wrote and the stories they passed on. I still think that literature is one of the best ways to learn about people, their values, and their dreams. And when it comes to medieval Persian culture, poetry was king. This week, I spoke with Dr. Shahzad Bashir about Persian poetry in the Middle Ages. Shahzad is a professor of history and religious studies at Brown University and the author of several books, including Sufi Bodies, Religion and Society in Medieval Islam, and the forthcoming A New Vision for Islamic Pasts and Futures. His latest work is part of the Cambridge Global Middle Ages series, and it's entitled The Market in Poetry in the Persian World. Our conversation on the absolutely massive tradition of Persian poetry, what it has in common with modern hip-hop, and its impact on Persian culture is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Shahzad, for coming on to talk about Persian poetry. It's very exciting to have you here, so thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's going to be fun. Okay, so your book is about Persian poetry. So let's start at the beginning and say, when we're talking about Persian as a language, who is speaking it? Geographically, who's speaking it?
So I'm focused on Persian as a literary language. So it's spoken certainly in many different dialects, but there is a written dialect itself that is a kind of lingua franca that for the period that I cover between the year 1000 and about 1800 is the lingua franca of what is today Iran, Central Asia, Afghanistan, and most of India, or South Asia generally, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, etc. So throughout this vast region in Asia and the Middle East, for these 8 centuries, Persian was the dominant literary language for intercommunication as well as literary expression.
So when we're talking about a literary language, how is that different from the oral language? Is it more formal? What's the difference?
It is more formal. It's not completely exceedingly diglossic, as some languages can be very diglossic, like Chinese or even Arabic is much more diglossic. But Persian, there is a diglossic element to it, but essentially the literary language kind of evolves out of the spoken language that exists in this region in about, let's say around the year 900 or so. But so over the course of the 10th century, the spoken language transforms itself into a literary language and then rapidly develops many different genres, often in conjunction with adopting genres that are already present in, especially in Arabic, which is the dominant language at the time in that region. By the year 1000 and after, it has already become very widespread. Immense amounts of writing is happening in it. And by the year 1200, so 2 centuries later, we even have essentially people writing retrospectives on what has already been produced. So as time goes for development of literary languages, it happens quite fast. And it retains a kind of dialectical relationship with the spoken language. So in the regions where it becomes the literary language, a lot of people are actually speaking Persian, so they have a more direct access. But there are other peoples, especially people who are speaking various types of Turkish languages and Indian languages, for whom it becomes a secondary literary language. Now, because of this connection, what ends up happening is that literary expression in Turkish and some Indian languages actually is based upon the pattern of Persian. And so there is then a neologism for that is sometimes people will talk about Persianate literature. What they mean is where the literary patterns are coming from established Persian genres, but the actual expression is in various forms of Turkic or Urdu, Hindi, etc., in different languages. So it has this complex place in a world that is fundamentally and constitutionally multilingual. There is no place where Persian would be the only language. It's always in the middle between different languages. It kind of stands out, especially for literary expression, and hence the significance of poetry.
I love that, how you mentioned in the book and just now that it's never by itself. It's always integrated into multicultural, multilingual spaces. And I think that is a really interesting place to situate poetry. So we're going to situate it on one more axis and say, why did you pick the period between 1000 and 1800 to look at Persian poetry?
Part of the challenge of the Global Middle Ages project is that when we say the Middle Ages, we're actually tying time down to a European timeline, right? So, for example, the way the Global Middle Ages project is initially defined is 1000 to 1500. There's nothing naturally that binds that time. It just happens to be the case that for discussing European history, roughly that time period has a kind of unity that allows us to speak continuously about it. So when we take the notion of the Middle Ages to other contexts, there's partial overlaps. So this is why I appreciated very much that the way the project was set up by Geraldine Heng and Susan Noakes is that they are not enforcing the exact time limits, and they're aware of the fact that time itself is an inflection of history. And so for my purposes, the distinction between, to put it in those terms, was it's about the year 1000 that we have Persian fully established as a literary language, starting the production of texts that are produced that in the long term become great classics and continue to be classics until the present. 1800 is a slightly more artificial, actually all temporal distinctions are artificial, but 1800 comes up because by 1800, the region we are talking about is deeply affected by colonialism, European colonialism. So especially by this time, the English East India Company is completely dominant over South Asia. Iran and Afghanistan remain independent, but they're heavily tied to both Russian and English influence. There is a tremendous amount of French literary influence that starts to happen in these regions. Central Asia, which is a major part of this world, is actually conquered by the Russian Empire. So the things that I'm talking about, they actually continue on after 1800 and to the very present, but they acquire a different flavor because basically the literary world gets into interaction with and dialogue with new forms of expression, literary expression that are coming from Europe. So that was the reasoning behind stopping at 1800.
I mean, you always have to pick somewhere, right?
Exactly. I mean, at some point, this is all random because one can create genealogies that can actually split those time periods easily.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, we got to pick something. So we'll go with 1000 to 1800. Okay. So finally, when you're approaching Persian poetry for this particular project, you're thinking of it in terms of a market for this. So why did you pick market as a metaphor for Persian poetry?
In a way, the idea came actually from an image that I found in a translation of a Turkish text into Persian, where they're talking about a king who goes on a hunting expedition, and the expedition gets lost. In the text, it's described that the whole party is basically floating on a raft in a river somewhere in the region that is now the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And in order, they have to while the time until someone comes for rescue. And what they start doing, what is very common in this context, which is to essentially have a poetic positing and response type of thing. Someone says a verse and other people have to either compose a verse or recite a verse that they know from someone else that somehow corresponds to it. It's a very, very common game that actually continues on to the present. So in that, when the chronicler is describing what is happening here, he says that a verse is like a pearl attached to the king's ear. So this really struck me as being very interesting, partly because it's the physical object that the pearl is, and that is connecting to the ear. And of course, it kind of gives this hint of a poetic verse being something material, like a pearl that gets connected to the ear. So it's the idea that an utterance is both something that is a mental act, that is spoken, but also something physical. So that's where it started. And the more I thought about it, I thought it would be a very useful metaphor. Ultimately, in order to try to explain why poetry mattered so much in this social, political, religious context. And I thought that thinking via the market, in part because we are very used to the notion of the market as determining the capitalist societies in which we live. It's not a completely transferable analogy or metaphor, but it helps to see why it mattered. It was like pearls, which is like money. And I chose the title as the market in poetry rather than of poetry, because if one were to say market of poetry, then the idea would be that the market is where poetry is transferable or exchangeable for money. which certainly happens because they get patronage and so on. But I wanted to say market in poetry in the sense that it's like a money market where the object itself is the currency. So that is to say, yes, it can transfer to other forms of wealth, such as money or goods and things like this. But it is a kind of treasure in itself that needs to be maintained by people who have the resources and so on. And in the poetic utterance itself and the materials in terms of Persian poetry that are available for these 8 centuries are just gargantuan. There are hundreds and hundreds. I mean, I talk about this one particular discussion of just the poets who, this is being described in about 1640. So this is much before 1800. And the person who just has this in their head produces a 5,000 page long work on just describing the poets, 3,500 people who have produced it. So it's massive. And part of the massiveness, how to encompass it. I thought, well, if we think of it, not so much that I have to describe all of what happened in these 800 years, but to think of it as a market across time and space that helps us see the transactional quality of poetry. It comes into being because every verse that is uttered is somehow a reflection of something that has already happened. So it shows the connections between people, and it's to show a world in constant flux like a market is. So that was the conceit in a way that led me to use the market as the metaphor.
Well, as you're saying, this is such a complex topic that you kind of need to situate it in metaphor, perhaps, to make it something that you can actually dig into little by little. So I'm going to ask you a really tough question in this whole framework of it being a complex topic. Where does a poet find themselves in society? Can we think of kind of a general space where they find themselves? Do they sit on a corner and spout poetry? Do they sit in the court? Where do we normally find poets, if we can generalize at all?
That's a fantastic question, a fantastic point. And actually, the way you put the question has made me think anew about it in some way. So thank you.
Thank you.
In a way, I would make a distinction between where we might find the poet and for what do we have evidence for where to find the poet. The evidence we have is coming from elite circles. So if we go by the evidence we have, the poets are in the courts because they are treated as exceedingly valuable craftspeople. So just as the kings need painters and builders and architects, they need poets in order to create their legitimacy for themselves as well as for the population. So in that way, I think that one could say that the quote-unquote natural habitat would be the circles of courts. And in that sense, what we have evidence for is poets moving between courts, moving across this vast region. So we have Iranian, Central Asian, and India all the time, going back and forth in different periods and so on. So that would be one thing. But I think the part of the reason I chose the market metaphor is that the other alternative is to think about poetry is in a patron-client relationship, where there is a wealthy person who then pays for the poets to be in their court. So a king or a prince or a princess, then they have these craftspeople. So that pattern can be seen very much. But in a way, what we also have a tremendous amount of incidental data in the materials that are collected is that people are spouting poetry all over the place. Even when the people are describing who themselves are in courts, when they're describing the poetic scene at a certain point, they are talking about going to some village and then they're just passing through with a group of traders or soldiers or something. And someone who's providing the food says, "Oh, you're a poet. You're interested in poetry. Well, here we have this woman who's kind of a natural poet." And the woman comes and she recites her verses. And this man actually then records it. So that kind of a person has no access to the court, but she is very much part of the overall circle. And partly underlying that is because poetry is completely a transportable craft, right? So because it goes from mouths to ears, and the talent is finite. So anyone can compose verses if they know the technicalities, etc. It has to be done in certain genres. But there is very much a sense that not everyone is a poet. to do it well, to do it right, requires something else that is very hard to define. And so they have this sense, and in my book, I discuss some of how people do this, what kind of decisions they're making about this. But there is a sense that you can have diamonds in the rough, someone who would never have access, but who just hears and then can produce and create and so on. So therefore, I would say making this distinction between the evidence versus the wider prevalence helps to understand how the market operates.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure this is an analogy that you've heard before and probably many times before, but it reminds me so much of hip hop in a lot of ways, the way that poetry works within the society, especially, and the thing that we're gesturing at right now, that you can be a starving artist or you can be a superstar that is doing these things. And they're both legit, and there's artistry in both of these things too. So this is an analogy that you've probably heard before, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then sometimes those starving artists get found and they become very wealthy. So that's also that, those rags to riches stories are there as well. So that's a great analogy. And I think the other reason that's a great analogy is because the power of this, the social traction and the idea of something that is artistic, that is produced by people, that has social value and currency as a means of expressing what it means to be human. So that's, I think, very much comparable to the world that I'm talking about.
Yeah, definitely. And there's this idea that you have to understand the people who have come before you and find your place in that world too. Right. And one of the things that you mentioned in this is that it's absolutely okay to copy other people's work as long as you do it better, right?
Yeah, that was a very interesting example that, so plagiarism is okay if you do it, if you're surpassing the origins. I mean, so there too, the interesting thing for me was that the kinds of things that matter to us, there are parallels to this in this world, but how they precisely articulate tends to be different, because the understanding of ownership in this market, it has, again, parallels with what we do, but it's not exactly the same as we would have it. One of the interesting things about this kind of a market is no one is regulating the market. It has built-in mechanisms for corruption as well as regulation.
So when you're talking about no one regulating this, what do you mean? Like anybody can jump in and just start being a poet and that's fine? Or do you mean like critics are saying who's allowed in and who's not allowed in? Is that what you're meaning by regulation?
Yeah, so it's the critics who can say that who is allowed in, who's good, who's not. And they're fighting intensively, constantly. There's tons and tons of books about critics saying, this one is bad, and they have favorites and they put each other's protagonists up against each other. So there's a lot of drama in this world. But interestingly, the critics are also complaining often, no one pays us any attention.
Yeah.
So that's the part where there's no authority. The authority is the opinion world within which the voice can be heard, whether of the critic or of the poet. Now, it has a connection to elites and royal circles because, of course, if wealthy people, or especially the kings, choose someone as the poet laureate, they then become the patrons of other poets, etc. So it's not completely a free-for-all. But there's no French Academy that is sitting deciding what's the French language is going to be.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, you can experiment with forms. One of the experiments that I thought you pointed out that was really interesting was near the end of the book, you're talking about a chronicler who talks about things in prose and then he puts in a verse, and he very specifically says at the beginning, none of my verses, except for like ones in the introduction, are taken from anywhere else, and this is exceptional, and this is just me, and I'm great at it. So tell us a little bit about how that chronicle works.
Yeah, so that's a good point. So the framework of this, there's a lot of boasting as well in all this world. Like the ones who are good, they also like to actually crow a lot and that I am the best. Or they will say, the ones that are good, the other conceit they have is I'm terrible. So that works in the same way because it's the kind of praise. It's a self-negation that's actually a praising in a certain time. This chronicle was fascinating, and to my knowledge, at least, it was unique where someone does this. So what he says is that only the first 4 verses are someone else's, the rest is all mine. Then he says, that if you were to take all the prose away and put all the verses together, it's a single poem, which produces its impossible levels of complexity in terms of permutations with respect to meaning, because the text is filled with these things, but they're all irregularly placed. And when we read them with the prose, the verses are connected to the prose. So it describes an event and the verse provides some kind of a reflection or meaning on what actually happened and so on. But if you take away the prose, so there are no events that are described in prose, and you have this very long poem. I think the chronicler is basically making the claim that there's a history hidden within the history. Only those who can really know would actually get to that. And it was difficult for me to even fully lay out an example of that because of the amount of complexity that is involved. And this book in particular had a very severe word limit. So it would like 20 pages just to explain one example. But the conceit of it is what is most interesting to me, because it's showing that in the understanding of this author, poetic expression can have a particular type of special knowledge. And even though it's expression, in the sense it's language that is being shared, it's hiding as much as it's actually saying. It's a very different attitude to language than we might think of in a kind of signifier type of way in which we might understand it. The signifier, which is the poetic verse, means to signify and hide the signification at the same time. There's another author whom I don't discuss in this book, but who puts it very well, where he says that language, especially poetic language, the most eloquent language, should be considered like chainmail on the body, because it is like a warp and weft that are words are basically being woven together to create language. It gives you a sense of what the body is that is underneath it, but it actually protects the body, and the body is the meaning. So it hints at the meaning, but actually doesn't allow direct access unless you are good enough to be able to get through the chainmail, or the one wearing the mail is willing to show you, etc. It ends up, language then ends up being a kind of coding as well. And this author, this chronicler, is putting that into effect through this chronicle that is simultaneously telling us what happened, and also telling us there are things that I'm telling you that I know you can't understand unless you spend a lot of time trying to figure out. And the mechanism for that is poetic expression.
I think we got there by talking about how there's no one regulating the rules, and this person seemed to just want to break all the rules and show off how they could break the rules.
Exactly. Well, one additional thing about that is really interesting for me, because what he says is that the meter that he's using is the meter of one of the ultimate classics that is, by the time he's writing, 700 years old. And that book is kind of the ultimate poetic expression of Iranian national myth, the Book of Kings. So he's actually saying that because the chronicle is about kings, it has to have this sound. History actually has the correct sound. And he lists out all the other works that are written in that meter. And he is doing this. So in a way, part of what poetry is doing is it's conveying its meaning, not even from what the words are saying, but through the patterns of sound that is echoing for hundreds of years, that he comes to embody through his own chronicle.
Yeah, I like that. And the connection, I think you call it at some point a mutual dependency between poets and kings, saying the king is nothing without his poet. And I think that's probably coming through in this example that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the poets say this directly. And this particular author, he hates the king who is employing him. This is especially very relevant for him to do it this way.
Oh, well, then you definitely want to hide the meaning as much as you can. Well, there is another chronicle. It's autobiographical by Babur, and it's taken and it's elevated by a poet who's basically like, no, it's not good bald like this. It's not going to convince anyone that you should be revered. So let me fix it. And one of the things you talk about is that this poet has now elevated this kind of bald chronicle into cosmic time. So this is one of the features of poetry, isn't it, for the Persian people who are writing in the Persian tradition?
Absolutely. Thank you for going to that, because yes, that's a critical element of it. And that's where the poetry is written in a way that it is always appealing to something universal. And so the citation of poetry takes an event with particular space-time coordinates and makes it somehow reflect something very universal. So in the case of this particular autobiography that's made into a chronicle, Babur's, he takes the moments that in Babur's own writing, it's like, yeah, I started going towards India at a certain point. But then he makes it like when the army gets going, it's basically the constellation of in the sky that are together. And it imbues the event with a grandiosity that is cosmic. And the only way to do that is through the invocation of poetic language. I was trying to think about this as to how this works in English. One thing is that, I mean, now much less so, but let's say 100 years ago, where people would know the Bible so much that in order to make an event seem greater than just what it was, one would cite something from the Bible or put it in biblical terms, and that would just make it much more cosmic. Or in modern English, I think often people do this by citing Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. Because the presumption is that everyone who, even if we don't know it, half the time we're citing Shakespeare somewhere or the other, because the language is so imbued with it, right? Mm-hmm. And especially when those citations come in, there is an invocation of universality, of application outside of normal frames of human space and time. And so poetry in the poetic dialect essentially works this way in this world. So it's not specific to a particular author, but authors can come to occupy that position. And then what I try to show in that section is that universality can be of very different types. So one can be cosmic when it is put in like the march of an army is like the march of constellation, or can be in terms of emotions, where the universal emotions that are attributed to human beings show up, that are introduced into a certain moment. Or it can be about aesthetics, where in one case where it's talking about the four walls of a room, which are like the four walls of a quatrain. So there's about actually aesthetics and physical beauty and so on.
Well, I think that you've brought up so many good points here. And one of them was talking about Shakespeare and universality. I think that is kind of the key to people trying to make things seem universal or cosmic these days. They will go back to Shakespeare. And then it's a funny thing, because as I was reading this, I was thinking about Shakespeare as being somebody who borrows things but makes them better. And that is why he has his fame. But while we're on universality, I think it's important to mention that there are quite a lot of Persian poets that are female that are famous as well. So can we talk about them for a second?
Sure. So we have a lot of incidental evidence for this. Certainly, the actual verses and stories of female poets are far less than that of men. It's very an androcentric world. Mm-hmm. But I particularly focused on the first time someone writes a whole collection introducing poets who are chosen because they are women. The earlier collections of poets or poets' lives that are available before this one is written, they tend to have a section on women. But this one says, I'm going to focus only on women. And he says that he is compelled to do this because he came across a poem which he thought was no less than anything that he had ever seen, right? So he basically compared it to the ultimate, most famous poet there was. So that's when he says that it occurred to me that clearly, there's no restriction on gender with respect to being a great poet. And then he goes looking for trying to figure out, well, what may be the distinction with respect to women? And the interesting thing is that the distinction can only be external. So he basically goes to the social circumstances in which the women are operating. The poetry itself is actually not gender inflected. There's a significant amount of work on this people have done where we have long compilations of poetry by a single woman or others as well. And it's very hard to assign gender because the language is so bound to the genre. And one additional benefit in Persian is that there is no gender. So you can read it as male or female when it's I, you, or she, or he. There is no he, she. So what that does is that the aesthetic qualities, especially when they are to be attributed to human bodies, male or female, they're essentially androgynous because they apply equally to male and female bodies. So even we have like long descriptions with lots of poetic citation of beauty as understood from different parts of the human body. The aspects of the body that they focus on, there is no male-female difference. The kind of lack of gender in the language is kind of operationalized by the author in this way, which, however, not to say that the overall world that at least is available to us from evidence is not very thoroughly androcentric and patriarchal, but it provides spaces. And my attention to this, even though the women are in a way exceptional, was it is only by understanding the exception and by paying special attention to the exception that we even understand what is at stake in some of the boundedness of the world.
What do you mean by what's at stake? You've caught my attention.
So for example, if they say, okay, well, as this person says that, well, I found that this poem was as good as any that any man wrote, right? And so it's attending to a relationship between social context and social existence as male or female and the poetic production. And so because he's acknowledging that this is good, even though the poet is a woman, so it helps us see what exactly is understood as being great within that. So that's one part of it. The other is that most of the poetry is about the question of love between human beings and also between human beings and God, etc. So it kind of occupies this emotional and affective space between humans, human bodies, human minds, and so on. So within that world, gender is absolutely central. So even though it's not grammatically inflected, the fact of the matter is that the question of attraction and falling in love and being ruined by love or having love requited, or what happens when it comes to the end of love, or what precisely is even love? Why does one fall in love? Does one fall in love because of physical attributes, or is it mental? So all of those things, those are like infinitely discussed in this world. And so in that way, I think gender is completely inextricable from the discursive world. And by paying attention to how the women are shown to operate in the world, it kind of gives us somewhat of a privileged access, precisely because of the exceptionality. So it shows us the stakes of the conduit between social relations and discursive and poetic production in some way.
Yeah, it's really interesting that they can work in a space that has no grammatical gender because it gives them such scope for exploring this. And I think that you mentioned in this that you kind of have to put yourself in the space of a male gaze. You know, if you're a poet writing at this time, it is very androcentric, as you're saying. So even a female poet is thinking from the point of view of a male. But it's really interesting the things that you can do and play with language when it has no gender. And that's really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think it's one of the great kind of built-in engines for this, because one of the interesting things is the normative understanding is both the gaze is male and the object is also male. So in that way, in a heterosexual context, the woman occupying the male gaze, in that way, it works very straightforwardly because it works even heterosexually. But male homosociality is not a problem at all for these folks either.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to make as well when you're trying to look at culture, which is such a big topic and such a big geographical spread and such a big temporal spread here. It's important to take a moment to think about what the norms are within this and for this kind of poetry. Even though on the ground level, on the street level, you're not encouraged to have a homosexual relationship. You can have a homosocial relationship and it can be expressed as poetry. So it's interesting and important thing to remember, especially when we're talking about if we are studying Europe, for example, how these two cultures will be interacting.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the kind of difference that becomes very radicalized once after 1800 when the Europeans are there. So that's part of the reason of breaking there, because then I mean, many of the same things continue, but they acquire very different flavors because you have different types of gazes that are now they're actually operational.
Yes.
And different objects.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Well, we've come to the end of our time, and it just kind of goes to show how much you've packed into this small element and how much else there is to say about it. So I'm so happy that you were here to introduce Persian poetry to the podcast audience. So thank you so much for being here.
My great pleasure. And thank you so very much for the invitation.
To find out more about Shahzad's work, you can visit his webpage at sites.brown.edu/Shahzad Bashir. His latest work is The Market in Poetry in the Persian World. And keep your eyes peeled for his next project, A New Vision for Islamic Pasts and Futures, available shortly from MIT Press. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's new, Peter?
Hey. Well, I'm right now in the United Kingdom as this podcast is coming out, and I'm at the Society for the Study of the Crusades and Latin East conference. So it's up near London, and a bunch of Crusades historians talking about stuff.
Oh, a whole week of Crusades.
Indeed.
That is intense. That's intense work.
It is like a lot of, big name scholars. And I'm at the very end giving a tiny little paper on the Crusades and YouTube.
Well, best of luck to you, Peter. What's going on the website while you are away?
Yeah, we've got Stephen Mulberger. His expertise is on tournaments. So he has a big article about the history of tournaments, a short history of tournaments. And
nice.
So that's pretty cool. Elizabeth Smith-Rosser has a piece on donkeys in Tang, China. Lots of interesting uses. And we've got like a ton of news that's been coming out lately. So lots of like archaeological discoveries in England, France, Norway, Israel, things like that. A ton of news coming your way.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. Have a great trip.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of medievalist.net's patrons on patreon.com for being such kind and generous supporters each and every month. Patrons can get hold of all sorts of great stuff like subscriptions to the Medieval Magazine and Medieval World Magazine, as well as a book club and exclusive maps by Tina Ross. Your patronage directly funds this podcast as well as medievalist.net's other work, so thank you. To get in on all the action, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from Persia to Polynesia, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Sobalski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.